In Canada have lost members of their families, friends who've been lost to euthanasia in Canada. This is a very sad milestone that we're surpassing 100,000 deaths in Canada since legalization. I remember Gaétan Barré, then the Quebec Health Minister, stating in 2014 during the debate in the Quebec National Assembly that he estimated there'd be about 100 per year euthanasia deaths. He said it'd be for extraordinary cases. Euthanasia now represents about 8% of all deaths in Quebec. Jocelyn Downey, a longtime euthanasia academic, told the Canadian Parliament's Special Joint Committee on Medical Assistance in Dying that is now studying euthanasia for mental illness alone, that Parliament must stick to the March 17th, 2027 timeline and permit euthanasia based on mental illness alone. Downey threatened the committee by stating what will happen if there is an extension or exclusion is that people will die by suicide. Downey is saying that the answer to suicidal ideation is suicide. And people will die by suicide if they don't have access to euthanasia. The threat that people who are denied euthanasia will die by suicide is a false pressure tactic. The Supreme Court of Canada accepted the suicide argument in Carter when it struck down Canada's laws that protected people from being killed by euthanasia. But the Supreme Court was also wrong. I'm not a lawyer, so I can say that. If the premise that people will die by suicide if euthanasia is not available to them is correct, then the suicide rate should go down after euthanasia became an option for Canadians who were not terminally ill. According to the Government of Canada's suicide mortality stats, there were 3,978 recorded suicide deaths in 2016, the year we legalized euthanasia. In 2021, there were 3,927 recorded suicide deaths. That is the year that we expanded euthanasia to people who are not terminally ill. But in 2023, 2 years after extending euthanasia to people who are not terminally ill, there were 4,735 reported suicide deaths in Canada, representing a 20% increase in 2 years. I'm not arguing that Canada's increase in suicide death was directly related to Canada's euthanasia expansion, but I am saying that if Jocelyn Downey was correct, the suicide rate should have decreased, whereas in fact it has significantly increased. Health Canada released their 6th annual report on medical assistance in dying last November 2025. That was for the 2024 stats. It indicated that we had a 6.9% growth in 2024 of euthanasia, and it said that we had about 16,499 reported deaths. That was up, as I say, from 15,427. Now, if you look at the 2025 data, now it's not been released by the federal government, but the Ontario data has been released. We had an increase of 7.3% in Ontario. We had an increase of 11% in Alberta. I predict that the 2025 increase is probably around 7%. That would put us at approximately 17,700. Now, obviously, that's just an approximate number. But when you start doing the math, obviously, you understand how I come to the fact that this month represents us passing the 100,000 mark. Okay? Clearly, there's no indication, though, that this massive growth in Canadian euthanasia death has resulted in a lower rate of suicide. Never happened. Suicide rates do not decrease in jurisdictions where euthanasia has been legalized. So, first of all, it's interesting. In December 2020, Senator Kuchar said in committee that that's when they were debating Bill C-7. The rain is not my friend. But anyway, he said in jurisdictions such as Belgium and the Netherlands where assisted death is legal, that the suicide rates have decreased. He then stated there's no link between assisted death and the rate of suicide in jurisdictions where it's legal. The problem with Senator Kuchar's statement in 2020 was that it was absolutely wrong. In the article, I sent him an article and I wrote an article to him explaining that in no jurisdiction that's legalized euthanasia or assisted suicide, that over a long period of time, they've experienced a decrease in suicide deaths. There's no jurisdiction, not one. In fact, in February 2022, bioethicist David Albert Jones published an article titled, "In Europe, Suicides Rise After Right to Die is Legalized." Jones provided a comparison between European nations that have legalized as compared to ones who have not legalized. And he has showed that in nations that had legalized euthanasia, the suicide rate was going up in comparison to those nations where, in fact, in general, at that time, suicide rates were going down in Europe. So almost every nation that had not legalized, their suicide rates went down, and in almost every nation that had legalized, suicide rates went up. Now that's not a direct correlation, but it shows you that legalizing euthanasia did not decrease suicide in any jurisdiction. In other words, Downey is using a false argument to scaremonger members of parliament into approving euthanasia for mental illness alone. Downey uses court decisions to uphold the position of the justices that are not, and they're not suicide prevention experts. They're not like Dr. Peter, who's worked for 30 years in the field. They have no idea compared to that. Minimally speaking, legalizing euthanasia does not lead to a decrease in suicide rates, and the data suggests that legalizing euthanasia actually has a suicide contagion effect, leading to long-term higher suicide rates. In other words, Downey is wrong. Anyway, we are mourning 100,000 euthanasia deaths in Canada since legalization, and we're challenging the federal government not to expand Canada's euthanasia law, but to launch a study done by neutral researchers, if you can find them, on the effect of Canada's out-of-control euthanasia regime. Thank you very much.